Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we've got a review thanks to channel patron Paul, and that's because he was kind enough to send me his Rosson Audio Design RAD-0s. If you've never seen these before, they're a strikingly beautiful headphone. They're an open back planar magnetic unit where no two units are exactly identical. In terms of sound, of course, they are identical, they do have that down pat. But these headphones in some ways are as much a work of art as they are a sonic experience. So we'll talk about all that in a moment, but to get things started, I just want to play a little game with you. And that is that I'm going to share with you now 4 different frequency response graphs. And these are for the 4 different headphones I've compared to the RAD-0s in this review, and the game that I want to play with you is this. As I show you these 4 graphs, take a moment to look at them and think about which of these 4 you think is going to represent the headphones that are most similar. And so in each case, you've got the RAD-0 as one line and a different headphone as the other line. Look through the 4 options as I show them on screen and make a mental note or put it in the comments down below as to which graph 1, 2, 3 or 4 you think represents the pair that sound the most similar. I'll reveal it when I get there and the results may or may not surprise you. With your guesses or decisions in mind or written down now, let's introduce the Rosson Audio Design RAD-0. As I said in the opening, these are an open back planar magnetic headphone, and they come in at around about $2,600 US. I say around about $2,600 because there are things you can do to alter the design of the cups from an aesthetic point of view, and that might alter the price a bit. But think about them as roughly $2,600 worth. What you're getting for that money is a gorgeous looking headphone, as you can see here. It is absolutely beautifully designed. They've all got these various different cup designs, where in this case it's a poured resin with all different colors and swirls and textures through it. They look absolutely beautiful. And they also feel great too. It's a beautiful fit and finish. You've got these lovely detailed grills on the back of the drivers, metal chassis with a really nice chrome finish, a lovely adjustment mechanism here that's not notchy in any way, but it's got this wonderful sense of friction that just grabs once you stop pushing it. There's also this headband, which I'll get to in a moment. It's not the most comfortable headband I've worn. There is an aftermarket modification available that will give you a suspension band style here, and I do think that's a good idea. But in terms of build quality, there's nothing but excellent fit and finish on the RAD-0s. On the bottom of each cup is a pair of 3.5mm connectors. They're slightly recessed, which could be a problem for some people if you're looking for aftermarket cables. But I think all of the aftermarket cables I had here seem to work fine, and as long as you've got a relatively slimline 3.5mm connector, you should be completely fine. On the inside of each of these cups is a 29 ohm planar magnetic driver, and while there's no sensitivity on the website from Rosson Audio Design, based on my listening test, they're probably sitting pretty close to 100 decibel sensitivity, give or take a little bit, because they perform pretty similarly in volume to something like the Sendy Audio Peacock, and I'll get to that one later. But the long and the short of it, or the takeaway of this is, they're not a hard headphone to drive, they're not a super easy headphone to drive, but they sit somewhere in the middle and are a moderately easy headphone to drive. Before we talk about sound quality, a couple of other things I want to mention are the accessories that you get. And as you can see here on the desk, there's just a simple cloth-bound, pretty straightforward cable. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing bad about it. It's soft enough to be comfortable to use. It feels durable. It's got a nice fabric weave around the outside, so it feels nice in the hand. And there's really, I don't think, anything to complain about. I did try the RAD-0s with some aftermarket cables I've got here, some nice quality copper Litz cables, and I do think maybe I got a slight upgrade in the sound, but this isn't a cable I would say you need to rush to upgrade, but one that I think you can choose to upgrade if you want a bit of a sonic improvement. As well as the cable, you also obviously get the carry case that these come in, and this is a variation of a Pelican or a Seahorse style case. It's one of those good, solid, hard case travel cases that seals away your headphones and keeps them safe from dust, moisture and damage if you are travelling around, or just looking to store them for an extended period. And so I think the accessory package is really good with the RAD-0s. I'm not really a huge fan of the hard cases. They're great if you are looking to on-sell the gear or travel with the gear because they do provide that protection in transit. But beyond that, I often feel like these cases are a bit of an overkill if you're buying a headphone and it's going to sit on your desk and this is just going to go in a cupboard. But that's a very personal preference thing. I don't dislike having these cases, I just don't tend to use them much. And so putting aside the accessories, let's talk about comfort as I alluded to before we get to sound. And the biggest issue with comfort for these is not their weight. They're a fairly heavy headphone, but they don't feel heavy on the head in my experience with them. Where the problem comes up though is in the design of the headband. And that's because you've really only got quite a small surface area that's taking all of the weight and the pressure of the headphone on the top of the head. And whilst they're actually more comfortable than I thought they would be, I did have some trouble with hotspots forming after a bit of time. If you're not familiar with hotspots, what I mean by that is after wearing a moderately heavy headphone where the contact point is all in one point of the head, after wearing that for a while, what you'll tend to find is there's a specific patch on the head where the headphone's touching or the weight's touching, and that will tend to get a bit warm and also a little bit painful. It's not a big deal with the RAD-0s, but it was enough that I was conscious and aware of the fact that I was wearing them. Paul was kind enough to send me the aftermarket suspension strap that goes with these. I didn't actually bother putting it on because the comfort wasn't bad enough that I felt the need for it, but it was also because I knew I wasn't listening to these or keeping these forever. For the 45 to 90 minute type sessions I tended to use these for, I was completely okay with their comfort, but by the end of each of those sessions, I was starting to feel them a bit on top of the head. So as I said before, if you're buying a pair of RAD-0s, I do recommend getting the aftermarket strap. But on the same hand, I wouldn't say not to buy them because of their comfort, because A, they're not dreadful in their stock form, and B, there's a very simple aftermarket modification that is completely reversible. And so with all that said, let's get to the bit that you're probably really interested in, and that is how do these sound? And the short answer is sublime. They're a beautiful sounding headphone. Probably for me, the standout from these is they've got a magical sense of mid-range, articulation, and detail retrieval that just brings vocals and instrumentals really to life, but without making them unnatural or over-enhancing anything. I describe their presentation as fairly intimate in the sense that everything's happening quite close to you as a listener and it's fairly left and right. But it doesn't get congested, which is a great feature. So it's an intimate but still fairly spacious sounding presentation from the RAD-0s. That does come back to bite them a little bit, as I'll talk about shortly, but not in a way that would ever make me say don't buy them, just in a way that you probably need to be aware of it depending on your tastes, your preferences, and specifically the genres you listen to. To expand on that point a little bit, and then I'll go further when we get to some of the comparisons, one of the challenges I've found with the RAD-0s is that if you listen to large orchestral recordings, so classical music for example, what you may notice is that the orchestra feels like it's presented in a fully left to right format. So it's almost like all of the musicians, rather than sitting in rows where there's depth, as there actually is in an orchestra, it's almost like they're all sitting side by side and stretched out in a line. And so what that does is it reduces the sense of scale and size and just ambience of an orchestral recording, and to me could make them sound a bit unnatural. I really only notice that on orchestral recordings. Anything else where there's less instruments and there's less of an expanse of instruments, I didn't really have issues with. And so as I said, I'll revisit that a little bit more when we get to the comparisons. But for me, unless you're a hardcore orchestral only type listener, I definitely think the RAD-0s can be a great choice. Across every other genre I tried, and indeed some orchestral recordings weren't so bad, it really depended on how the recording was produced and therefore how the headphones presented it. So do keep that in mind, but we'll go into more detail shortly. Moving on from there, I describe the overall tonality of the RAD-0s as slightly rich, but generally pretty neutral. Or maybe I should use the term natural. They've got a beautiful sense of natural timbre, instruments sound the way that they should, they sound real, they sound lifelike, nothing's distracting or overemphasised. To me, knowing that Alex Rosson was one of the founders of Audeze and therefore one of the designers of the original Audeze LCD2s, to me you can definitely hear a bit of that LCD2 sound in the RAD-0s. But it's like he's taken what he did with the LCD2 so many years ago and just upgraded everything. To me, it does everything that the LCD2 did in a wonderful way, and does most of it, if not all of it, better still. And I don't mean to suggest that it's performing like the LCD2. I don't actually own the LCD2 anymore, although I did own a pair for an extended period quite some time ago. But my point is I can hear the lineage of the RAD-0s when I think about what I remember from the LCD2s. And that, coming from me at least, is definitely a compliment. I used to love the LCD2s, I still do, I just haven't heard them for a long time. And so the RAD-0s very much pick up that thread and make it better for me. Two final points I want to make about sound quality before we get into the detailed comparisons is that the bass weight and the bass presence from the RAD-0s is really, really enjoyable as well. They've actually got a great sense of extension in both directions, so the treble, even though I haven't talked about it, is also excellent. It's extended, it's detailed, it's not overdone in any way, but it's also not lacking. But when you think about the bass, what I like about the RAD-0s is that they've got a good sense of presence and weight, but it's not over-enhanced, it's not boomy or bloomy or slow or anything like that. In fact, as I listened to these and wrote some of my notes, one of the thoughts that I had was that bass lovers might want even more bass than these give. So don't think of them as a bassy headphone, even though I've said that they do have a slight richness to the sound. That richness is much more through the mid-range and the general tonality, maybe a bit of the decay of the sound. They've got a richness to them, but that doesn't translate into this very warm or bassy sounding headphone. They're much closer to neutral and natural than they are to bassy. And what that all translates to for me is they're overall what I would describe as a very enjoyable listen and a very easy listen, but I don't mean that as a backhanded compliment. What I'm saying there is that they do everything in a very balanced, very natural way that's just thoroughly enjoyable, but can also be exciting and engaging when the music calls for it. And so in isolation, without comparing the RAD-0s to anything just yet, I think they're an absolutely fantastic sounding headphone. And so let's jump into my comparisons now to see just how good they are when you stack them up against some of the really strong competition. The first headphone that I chose to compare the RAD-0s to was the Sendy Audio Peacock. These are a bit of a dark horse favourite for me. They were panned by some reviewers, but I think maybe there might have been some early product variants or something like that, because what I heard from them was quite different to what they described. And indeed, they're one of my favourite headphones today. With a retail price of just under $1,500, they're a full $1,100 less than the RAD-0s. And so my reason for comparing the Peacocks to the RAD-0s was the Peacocks are a planar magnetic that I know that I really like, and with a significant price difference, it was a way of me finding out if the RAD-0s are worth the extra money. One of the tracks I listened to for this test was The Man in the Station by John Martin, and what I heard from the RAD-0s on this track was that the guitar and the gentle snare work in this track is wonderfully articulate and present and clear from the RAD-0s, and it's really engaging to listen to. John Martin's vocals come across smooth, but with a nice sense of texture. And while I was very aware of the quite left-right staging of the RAD-0s, in the sense that everything is spread in left to right and not having a lot of depth, it didn't really trouble me. It didn't take me away from the enjoyment of the track. And so from the RAD-0s, The Man in the Station was sounding absolutely fabulous, and so I switched over to the Peacocks to see how they compared. Coming from the RAD-0s, the Peacocks do sound a little bit lacking in dynamics, and also that general sense of articulation that the RAD-0s do so well. Now when I'm talking about articulation, it's that sense of kind of cleanness and clarity in the beginning of each note. The transients, things like plucking of strings, the hitting of a snare, anything that's got a bit of a leading edge and a bit of energy to it, the RAD-0 just picks that up beautifully, and the Peacock's just a tiny bit lacking in comparison. The Peacocks offer a better sense of depth in the soundstage, and overall I would say the soundstage is a better shape from the Peacocks, but they're lacking that sense of aliveness, and therefore the lifelike kind of reality or sense of reality that the RAD-0s present. I feel like bass presence and weight is also better from the RAD-0s, and while the Peacocks probably bring just a tiny bit more sense of texture and clarity in the upper registers, I don't really feel like it's an area where I'd say one's better or worse, because the RAD-0 is not lacking there, they're just presenting it a little bit differently. And so in some ways I'd say the RAD-0 is like a slightly richer and generally better version of the Peacock, with unfortunately slightly less comfort and a slightly smaller, more intimate soundstage. But if you like what you've heard from the Peacocks, if you've heard them, and you're wondering if these would be a good next step, I do think they're a nice upgrade, so long as you're happy to go a little bit richer and lose a little bit of soundstage depth. But for me, the RAD-0s are worth the extra money. I do think they're a better headphone, and so that moved me on to my next test, which is with the HiFiMan Arya Stealth Magnet version. These retail for $1,600 and therefore are $1,000 less than the RAD-0s. And this was a test I was really interested in because the Arya Stealth Magnet version is such a strong contender at its price. For many people, the Arya can be an endgame headphone, and so I was interested to see if the RAD-0s again could justify the extra price tag. And that's of course talking only about their performance sonically, because part of the price tag we should always remember is down to things like build quality, the look, the feel, the comfort, all of that gets wrapped into it as well. But this comparison is largely focused just on sound quality, with of course some comments about things like comfort where it's relevant. Now before I dive into this one, if you're playing the frequency response graph game, I should mention that the Peacock is not the one that I felt was the most similar to the RAD-0s. There were similarities, but there is a different headphone which is almost identical in many ways, and we're not there yet. Maybe it'll be the Arya, watch on and find out. Talking about the Arya again now, one of my test tracks for this comparison was Talk Show Host by Radiohead, starting with the RAD-0s again, and it feels like they're almost made for this type of music. It sounds so good through the RAD-0s. The overall presentation is smooth, but detailed, and just thoroughly engaging. The RAD-0s pull you straight into this track. They've got you really focusing on Thom Yorke's vocals, and it's just a great listening experience. There are buckets and buckets of clarity coming from the RAD-0, but there's no brightness at all, and that's something I really respect about them. They're able to bring this wonderful sense of detail and clarity without doing it through these crazy treble spikes that some manufacturers use. And I'm not trying to subtly criticize the Arya here, because I actually really like the way the trebles tune on the Arya, but I also very much respect the way the RAD-0s are bringing detail without excess treble and therefore without causing fatigue. As I've already mentioned, Thom Yorke's vocals in this track are wonderfully resolved by the RAD-0s, they're clear in space, and most importantly, it allows all of the backing instrumentation to kind of revolve around the vocal without getting in the way of it. Moving over to the Aryas, and it's a vastly different sonic experience. Because of the extra treble and less richness from the Arya, the sound is immediately a lot drier coming from the Arya, and it took me quite a while to let my ears adjust to the difference. The opening guitars, which had this wonderful sense of presence and weight, but also articulation from the RAD-0s, are now much cleaner, much more textural from the Aryas, but lacking that sense of richness that you get from the RAD-0. Likewise, Thom Yorke's vocal is now more textural from the Arya Stealth Magnet, and in both cases, so the opening guitars and the vocals, I wouldn't say one's better or worse, they're just different. If you love hearing all those textures and the fine details, the Arya is preferable. But if you like more of that richness with the details still there, then the RAD-0s would be the better choice. As we continue on through the track, the Arya is lacking a bit of bass weight and bass presence compared to the RAD-0, and so it's very much a trade-off. For me with the RAD-0, I feel like they're giving me the whole picture of the sound, whereas the Aryas are trading off some of that bass weight and presence, and therefore also the mid-range richness. We're trading that off with the Aryas to get more of the treble detail and more of the treble textures. And so it's going to depend on what you like and the sorts of genres you listen to. And in fact, in many ways, it's very hard to compare the RAD-0 and the Arya because they're such different sounds. What I will say though is that when you get to around the 2-minute mark in this track, that being Talk Show Host, the track gets quite crunchy, there's a lot of deliberate distortion added to the percussive sounds, and the Aryas get quite unenjoyable. The RAD-0 still sounds crunchy, it still shows you that there's a lot of distortion and texture being added to those sounds, but it doesn't get nasty to listen to, whereas with the Aryas it became quite unpleasant. And so for me, whilst it's hard to say that the RAD-0s are necessarily worth more than the Aryas, I do think they're offering a very different sound, and so far I haven't found a headphone that offers what the RAD-0s do at a cheaper price point. And so take that into account. For me, the Aryas and the RAD-0s are two headphones that could easily live side by side within the same collection. And so I won't try to say which one's better or worse, or whether the RAD-0s are worth more money, because they're just too different. And so that also goes to tell you that those frequency response graphs aren't the ones that I think sound the most the same. And so let's move on to our next headphone in the ZMF Atrium. Given that I've currently got the Atrium and the Verite open and the Verite closed here, I had to choose which of these headphones I wanted to put up next to the RAD-0. And so I ended up choosing the Atrium because A, it's my favourite out of those three, but also I felt like it had the most similar sound quality to the RAD-0 because it's a little bit richer, not quite as fast as the Verite Open, and therefore was most likely going to be similar to the RAD-0s. The Atriums retail for $2,500, making them just $100 different from the RAD-0s. The Atriums are generally a very comfortable headphone, And it's probably worth flagging at this point that all of the 4 headphones I tried up against the RAD-0s are more comfortable headphones in their stock form. As I said, you can get that aftermarket strap for the RAD-0s if you want to, and indeed I'd recommend it, but in their stock form, the RAD-0s are the least comfortable headphone of all 5 in this review. And so turning now back to sound quality, one of the tracks that came on while I was comparing the RAD-0s and the Atriums was Your Power by Billie Eilish. The first headphone I tried presented sound which had rich, articulate and textured guitars with a great sense of harmonics to them. They had the vocal kind of hovering in space with this really nice focused image and everything else then around it, of course. They had deep, solid and well-controlled bass. And everything had a nice balance of texture, smoothness, bass weight, presence. It was really just a wonderful experience. Changing over to the second headphone, and I'm deliberately not telling you which one's which yet, the second headphone I tried once again had that sense of articulation through the mid-range, but the guitars now were lacking just a tiny bit of that harmonic richness that I'd heard from the first headphone. Both sounded good, but the first headphone just brought the instruments a bit more alive with the sense of harmonics that you got in addition to the clarity and articulation. From the second headphone, the vocals were just ever so slightly less focused. It was almost like if it was a visual image that someone had taken the vocalist and just blurred the edges by 1 or 2%. Very, very subtle, but it wasn't as clearly defined from the second headphone as it was from the first. The second headphone's presentation comes across slightly smoother. It's not bad in any way, but it's not quite as well resolved and defined overall. I felt like the second headphone was also a touch slower on the bass notes, and also comparatively lost a little tiny bit of punch when comparing the two. And so ultimately for me, headphone 1 was doing everything that headphone 2 did, only all done slightly better. The clarity and articulation was there in both, but better in headphone 1. The image focus and clarity was also in both, but slightly better in number 1. The bass presence and punch and overall balance with the frequency response was great in both, but also slightly better in number 1. And so consistently, these are the two, the ZMF Atrium and the RAD-0, that are absolutely the most similar in my experiences. And so if you guessed that graph number 3 was the one that would sound the most similar, then you were correct. Let me know down in the comments if that was what you chose, or if you're surprised to hear what I'm saying. I don't tend to make any judgments based on graphs, and indeed I did all of my listening tests before I did my measurements, and I have to say that looking at the graphs, these aren't the headphones that I would have thought would have sounded the most similar, but they absolutely do. I'm guessing though you're wondering, which of these headphones am I saying is the better one, headphone number 1, and which one am I saying is the slightly less good one? And the answer is that the ZMF Atrium is the one that is slightly better. It just does everything the RAD-0 does, but takes it to a different level. It's not a huge step, we're talking a few % difference. But when you factor in the comfort and the price, I think the ZMF Atriums have once again proven themselves to be absolutely stellar. The other thing that I didn't mention before, and it is worth mentioning, is that the soundstage from the ZMF Atrium is also bigger and better than what you get from the RAD-0. The RAD-0 has that slightly flat left-right presentation, whereas the Atrium produces a wonderful, kind of spherical and open spacious soundstage. So for me, if I had to choose between the two, it's an easy choice to the ZMF Atrium, but the fact that the RAD-0 comes so close to the Atrium is also a testament to the fact that the RAD-0s are fantastic as well. If you watch my recent headphone tier list, you'll know that the Atriums are right up there as one of my absolute favourite headphones. And so the fact that the RAD-0s are nipping at their heels goes to show that if the Atriums didn't exist, these would absolutely be very high on my list of recommendations, and probably I'd be buying a pair for myself. So don't take this as a knock on the RAD-0s. If you like the idea of them as a planar magnetic, or you like the look of them better, they're very, very close to the Atriums and a wonderful, wonderful choice. And so let's close things out now with a final comparison, which is to the Meze Elite. These are my absolute favourite headphone. They're also a planar magnetic, but they're also way more expensive. I included this comparison purely because I thought a number of you might be interested, and so let's fly through it pretty quickly just to paint a bit of a picture. The Elites cost $1,400 more than the RAD-0s, so you are spending significantly more money, but you're getting a wonderfully comfortable headphone that is an absolutely incredible piece of engineering. And then knowing that I already think the Elites are one of the best headphones on the planet, it's safe to say they're going to be better than the RAD-0s. But that said, let's talk about in what ways. One of my test tracks for this was I Will by Matchbox 20, and what I heard was a great overall sound that again was rich, detailed, textural, all those things I've already described. Listening to this track once again emphasised for me that the RAD-0s are absolutely magic on things like acoustic guitars, anything that's kind of plucked, strummed. They just have this beautiful sense of clarity through those strumming and plucking type sounds. Where things start to go a little bit awry though, is that later on in this track, there's a section where the strings come in, and once that happens, the presentation from the RAD-0s gets just a little bit wonky. Its lack of depth in the soundstage just means that it's hard for it to place all the different sounds in space, and things start to sound a bit unnatural and a bit unrealistic. It's not a huge issue if you're just listening casually for enjoyment, but if you're doing any critical listening, it can get a tiny bit off-putting. Switching over to the Elites, and the first thing I noticed was that due to their tuning, they come across initially sounding a little bit less clear or a little bit less detailed in certain frequencies. And I'm putting that down to the fact that there's a dip between 1 and 3 kHz on the Elites that's not present in the RAD-0s. Having said that, once my ears started to adjust, because of the general performance of the Elites, their sense of clarity and articulation is actually as good or maybe better than the RAD-0s. It's just that at those particular frequencies, there's a bit of a drop in the Elites, and therefore it took my ears just a few moments to adjust. Interestingly, the overall tuning of the Elites manages to pull off an interesting trick in that they sound both a bit more delicate than the RAD-0s, but also richer and fuller at the same time. And again, I think that's largely due to the frequency response tuning, in that there's a little bit more of a dip through the middle, and it allows the bass and the treble to come forward with just a bit more prominence, but not overdoing it at all. Probably for me, the biggest difference between the RAD-0s and the Elites was the sense of separation and staging from the Elites is just so much stronger. At that section I mentioned before, where the backing strings come into I Will, the Elites were much better able to place all of the sounds in space and keep it sounding natural and lifelike. And so for me, while I'd say that the gulf between the Elites and the RAD-0s isn't massive, we're not talking about a 10 times leap in performance or something, but there's no doubt to me that the Elites are on a different level technically. They're doing a number of things better, and whilst the tunings are debatable and preferential, I think technically the Elites do justify their price tag. And then of course you're talking comfort and build quality as well. It's clear to me at least why people would choose to spend significantly more on the Elites compared to the RAD-0s. Again, that's not a knock on the RAD-0s, it's just showing why you might choose to spend more money. And so to bring all of this to a close, I think the RAD-0s are a wonderful headphone. If you're not put off by the soundstage descriptions I've given, in other words, if you're not listening to a lot of genres that require a lot of depth, like orchestral music as I mentioned before, if you're not put off by that, and if you're happy to have a headphone that's not the most comfortable for long sessions, or that you want to put an aftermarket modification onto, if that all sounds okay to you, then the RAD-0s are fantastic and I'd highly recommend them. To me, it just so happens that there's some really strong competition at around about the same level as the RAD-0 in terms of price, and below it as well if you think about the Aryas, although they are very different. But for me, the only headphone that really offers a similar experience tonally and musically from an enjoyment point of view, the only thing that I've heard that comes close so far is something like the ZMF Atrium. And it just so happens that I think the Atrium's doing everything just a tiny bit better. As I said before, the Atrium is one of my all-time favourite headphones, and so that's again a recommendation for the RAD-0s if you want a planar, if for some reason you don't want an Atrium, or of course if you like the look and the uniqueness of the RAD-0s as well. I don't think there's any debating that these are stunning looking headphones, and the build quality, as I said before, is nothing short of exceptional. So if you're in the market for a headphone around about this ballpark, you like the idea of an articulated, rich but detailed sound, then definitely check out the RAD-0s if you can, because I do think they're a great choice. For now though, I want to once again say a huge thanks to channel patron Paul for sending me his pair of RAD-0s, and as always, I hope you found this review useful and helpful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.